Good afternoon, good morning. We are starting in 4 minutes. Thank you. We'll be starting in 4 minutes. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. I am Dr. Mojen Sengimana, Secretary General, African Organization for Standardization. I would like to welcome you once again to our ARZO monthly webinar. Today, we will be discussing the rules of origin and trade, looking at interdependencies between rules of origin, the product that we trade on, the trade itself, access to the market, industrial policy issues, and how we can really enhance trade within value chains at the continental level, looking at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I welcome all of you to this webinar, and I thank all the participants for joining us every month. I also thank our speakers for today. Rules of origin determine where goods originate, not where they have been shipped from, but where they have been produced or manufactured. As such, the origin now is qualified as an economic nationality. That is the discussion that we will be having. Rules of origin as integral part of international trade agreements and define the conditions under which products are eligible for preferential treatment and are like a passport for a product to enter a free trade area. The discussion today will also touch on the issues of supply chain. We have developed countries. We will be having our speaker from the European Union. When you look at the number of component suppliers operating in different countries, is there. It shows a bigger increase of those numbers. More and more imported inputs are involved in the production of the final goods. This means that weighting the relative importance of the various factors of production has become essential in drafting of rules of origin. That's led to either a restrictive or complex rules of origin, demanding sophisticated processes that may really hamper the trade within the FTAs, the free trade areas. The discussion will once again also touch on the private sector. What are the private sector we'll be talking about? Are we happy of what is going on the continent, as different regional economical communities have different rules of origin and different application, and currently being considered under the AfCFTA. We will also hear from the private sector. We would like to know today how the private sector will use this the opportunity presented under the AfCFTA. Rules of origin should normally be simple, transparent, trade facilitating, and predictable. Today we have our different speakers from the private sector, as I said, from East Africa, private sector, from the experts that we have on the continent, the experts that we have at European Union level, which are our partner in trade, and we will be having also the World Trade Organization talking to us. Our first speaker is Laura Naliaka, who is a trade policy fellow at the Africa Trade Policy Center at United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Her area of expertise include development economics and international trade. She previously worked at the African Economic Research Consortium, where she oversaw a project on mitigating the adverse effects of COVID-19 in East Africa on various sectors. Prior to that, she was a consultant at the Economic Commission for Africa Sub-Region Office for East Africa, focusing on inter area, the AfCFTA, region integration, trade, and balance of payments. She held a master's in development economics from the University of Sussex. She will be discussing the rules of origin as a passport for circulating goods originating from a free trade area. Africa's experience on rules of origin and the outlook for the AfCFTA, learning from previous experience, including the EPA, Regional Economical Communities, FTAs, and COMESA SADC EAC tripartite. I welcome Laura Nariaka. You can share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, SG, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Okay, let me first share my screen. I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, indeed. You can put to full presentation.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, SG, for inviting ECA to participate in this really important webinar on rules of origin, because as we are aware, rules of origin will contribute to the success of the AfCFTA, depending on, or rather if they are properly designed or implemented. But to begin, let's go back to the basics and also building on what just the SG has given in his introductory remarks. So rules of origin are essentially the criteria which are used to determine the origin or the source of a product. And if we look at it, it is easy to determine the country or the origin of a product when the production occurs entirely in just one country. But this becomes rather complicated when the production process takes place in more than one country. So for instance, let's assume that I am a fashion designer based in Kenya and dealing in African print fabric. But I import the fabrics that I use in my business from Ghana, where the cotton is harvested and processed and then sent to Kenya as the African print textile. So the rules of origin will help in determining the country which should be considered as the source or origin of the African print clothes that I will produce. So here it will help us to know, like, should the source of these clothes be considered to be Kenya or to be Ghana? In addition to that, the rules of origin are in principle supposed to, sorry about that. So in principle, rules of origin are also supposed to ensure that the benefits of a free trade area actually accrue to the state parties, and this is by preventing transshipment of products from third-party countries. So let's go back to my previous example on African print fabrics. So Ghana could cheaply import fabrics from another country which is not within the AfCFTA, let's say a country in Asia, and print the designs in Ghana and then ship the African print fabrics within the African countries under the AfCFTA. The danger of this is that it could potentially flood the markets and affect the cost competitiveness, especially of other African countries which are also involved in the production of similar fabrics, and it can also lead to trade disputes. So we can classify the rules of origin into two main categories. We have the product-specific rules of origin and the regime-wide rules of origin. So let's start with the product-specific rules of origin. These are essentially established for specific products or sectors. So in this case, the products could entirely be produced or sourced from one country. Of course, this is easy to determine, as I previously said. Or in another instance, it could be that the processed goods in a particular country must meet a certain threshold or percentage of locally or regionally sourced inputs for it to be considered as originating from a particular country. And we also have the change of tariff classification. But these product-specific rules of origin are normally considered to be a bit restrictive or more strict. And this is because any deviation from this threshold or percentage, any deviation from this threshold or percentage can lead to rejection of the products which are originating from a particular country. And also, in addition to that, these stringent requirements may also outweigh the competitive advantages of sourcing the products from a different country. And when we move to the regime-wide rules of origin, these are essentially a set of generic rules established for all products and sectors. So I hope you can see the difference. In the product-specific rules of origin, you are looking at specific sectors and products. But when you move to the regime-wide rules of origin, we are looking at products within a particular. We're looking at rather all products or all sectors cumulatively. And compared to the product-specific rules of origin, the regime-wide rules of origin are considered to be more flexible. So if we look at the African regs, here essentially we're looking at the 8 AU regs and also the tripartite free trade area, you will notice that most of the existing preferential trade areas and also the regs in Africa use a combination of both the ROO criteria that I have alluded to in the previous slide. So let's take the example of the tripartite free trade area. And as we know, the tripartite comprises of EAC, SADC, and COMESA. So the negotiation process for this FTA resulted in a regime that incorporates both the product-specific and the regime-wide rules of origin. Because let's look at, one of the things you can look at is the change of tariff criterion, which falls under the product-specific rules of origin. And just to expound on this, when we talk about tariff classification, it essentially means that the originating status is conferred to the final product if its tariff classification is different from that of the imported inputs that were used to manufacture it. And it also has aspects of the regime-wide rules of origin, which I've also alluded to. Under this, we have tolerance and the absorption rules. So tolerance essentially means that, just as the name suggests, the firms are allowed a specified maximum value of inputs from third countries, which they can use in the processing of their final products. And when we move to the absorption rules, still under the regime-wide rules of origin, in this case, the firms are allowed to use inputs from third parties which have acquired originating status and various specific processing requirements. And the firms are allowed to retain this status status of the products, which they will use as inputs in the production of their final products. So what are some of the lessons that we can derive from the existing trade agreements with regards to rules of origin? One of the key things that we find out is that if the rules of origin are strict or rather restrictive and costly, it might have an impact on its uptake. And this is because if the cost of compliance is too high, then the exporters or the traders might opt to go for non-compliance, which might at the end of the day be a cheaper option. So in this case, the exporters will choose to trade at the MFN rates and forgo the benefits from the regional trade agreements, such as the AfCFTA or the various other PTAs that are in existence. And here we also have a number of studies which have actually shown this to be the case. We have, first of all, a study which was done though a while back, just showing the benefits between, showing the restrictiveness and the impact of AGOA and EU's everything but arms when it comes to stimulating trade. So because trade under the AGOA incorporates the rules of origin that are used are a single transformation, which are rather more flexible compared to what is considered or covered under EU's everything but arms, that is the double transformation, which is considered to be a bit restrictive, then the finding is that trade under the more flexible rules of origin in the AGOA has actually stimulated exports further compared to that under the EU's everything but arms. And also to look just at another practical example within the continent, though this happened a couple of years back in South Africa, where Woolworths, which is a company which operates, I think it's based in South Africa, refrained from using the SADC preferences and instead opted to pay the full tariffs because of the costly process of administering the rules of origin. So this just goes to show that uptake of the preferences granted under the various regional trade agreements will also be dependent on the kind of rules of origin that are to be considered in the various trade agreements or rather regions. So when it comes to the AfCFTA, what we need to consider is having rules of origin which are designed in a manner that most of the farms within the continent will be able to utilize the tariffs and non-tariff preferences offered by it. And this is particularly important because, as we know, most of the farms operating in Africa, or the bulk of the farms in Africa, are SMEs and MSMEs. And we can't afford to leave out some of the farms when we are harnessing the benefits of the AfCFTA. And also this goes hand in hand with the fact that the countries within Africa, the African countries are at different levels of development, and the majority of them are least developing, can be categorized as least developing countries. So the rules of origin that will ultimately be designed and adapted by the various countries will have an impact on whether the farms or these countries will benefit ultimately from the AfCFTA. And as the SG has mentioned, when it comes to the AfCFTA, it will be really critical to have simple and transparent rules of origin. And lastly, the other thing that needs to be considered when you're talking about rules of origin under the AfCFTA is awareness. As we know, knowledge is power. So there needs to be mechanisms to ensure that information on the rules of origin are accessible to businesses, and particularly the MSMEs, SMEs, women and youth-owned businesses. Because as I've mentioned, the AfCFTA needs to be inclusive. The benefits can't really accrue to certain countries. And the only way we can ensure that the benefits are all inclusive is by ensuring that we don't leave out certain segments of the population. I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you for listening, and over to you, SG.
Thank you very much, Laura. Very interesting when you even give an example of Woolworths when there are rules of origin in the SADC, but Woolworths shows not to go through the rules of origin in the SADC, then they paid everything. Yeah, meaning we need really to do more. It comes to my mind now, looking at the regional economical communities, rules of origin, and looking at also the provision of the acquis under the regional economical communities. How do you think we'll be dealing with these issues of the acquis within the regional economical communities now when we have the AfCFTA? Would it be probably now our industry going to continue using probably the regional economical communities and not have really a big impact on what are the provision under the AfCFTA rules of origin?
Thank you for that. When it comes to the RECs, of course, we have to acknowledge that they're actually supposed to be the building blocks of the AfCFTA. So we can't really ignore the experience of the RECs or what the RECs have done so far when it comes to developing and implementing the rules of origin. And as we know at the moment, because we have, as I've mentioned, we have 8 RECs, and we also have the TFTA, which will come into, I don't know whether it's already in existence, but it's in the pipeline. So that also adds another layer. And what even complicates this further, is that in addition to each of these RECs having their particular rules of origin frameworks, we also have particular countries which belong to multiple RECs. So that means if I am a business, let's say based in Kenya, Kenya is a member of ESC and a member of COMESA. And you might find that there are certain provisions which are different between the two recs. So it brings a lot of confusion when it comes to what should I focus on, which rules should I, which rules should I base my production on? And of course, it might also lead to increase in compliance costs, whereby maybe I might need to comply with what is being offered on the COMESA side and what is being offered on the ESC side. But the good thing, or now the silver lining, is the AfCFTA now coming into play, because now with the AfCFTA, it's a chance for the continent to have a framework which borrows from what is already being done at the RECs, looking at what has worked for the RECs. Maybe if it comes to maybe the rules of origin being implemented in COMESA or in ESC or SADC, what are the things that are letting it down? What leads to minimal uptake of the preferences within the FTA, within the REC? Or what are the things, what are the benefits, or what are the positive things that we can learn from that? And based on this can be used now to make something which is more stronger or more robust rules of origin. And with that, it will be easier for businesses operating in most of these countries to be able to now trade easily under the AfCFTA. But of course, the challenge will be, the challenge that we might anticipate is if the rules that are under the AfCFTA framework are a bit different from what is existing in the various RECs. But one way we can ensure that this doesn't happen is having the framework at the continental level to be the overarching framework, and then having the RECs to align some of their rules of origin to mirror what has been agreed upon at the continental level. And with this, I think now going back now to answer your question in a single line, it will mean that we have learned from the challenges that are currently being experienced in the RECs, and refining the rules of origin further to ensure that the businesses and the various countries are able to take it to easily apply it and benefit from the AfCFTA or trade within the continent.
Thank you, Laura. You also mentioned AGOA. You mentioned AGOA. You mentioned how flexible in the study done by ECA, how flexible the AGOA provision versus the EU provision. In that, in one of your slides, you also mentioned on the most favored nation principle, MFN. Now, looking at the issue of the AfCFTA, we want to increase intra-Africa trade, meaning made in Africa product or manufactured product at our continent. I am now looking at on the side of the quality product that we have. What then should be the role of standardization and the quality infrastructure in this to facilitate the benefits that we have under the AfCFTA?
Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. I think I'll start with, when we're looking at trade and the benefits that can be derived from regional trade agreements, including the AfCFTA, we need to look at it holistically. Of course, the first step has been reduction of tariffs, reduction of non-tariff barriers. And we also need to go a step further and look at what are the other aspects or the other variables that also need to be taken into consideration to ensure that there's an increase in trade, that businesses are able to trade easily within the continent. So when we look at the AfCFTA has opened or presented a level playing ground for farms within the continent. But at the same time, it can be looked upon as a poisoned chalice because it's now an open playing field. It's survival for the fittest. If you don't have the competitive edge, you're going to be edged out. If your goods are not up to standard and you're competing with other goods, other even similar goods produced within the continent, you're going to be edged out. And now this is where the issue of standards and quality comes in. But maybe I should backtrack and go to, at the moment when it comes to standards, of course, still going back, it's still again similar to what I'd said about the rules of origin. The various RECs, various countries have the different standards. But now at the AfCFTA level, what needs to be done is we need to first harmonize some of these standards, which can then be used by the farms which can then be considered by their farms in the production process of the goods to be exported. And why standards are important is because, first of all, they have a signaling effect. If I have to, let's say if I have 2 pens, not really pens, which example can I use? Let's talk about milk. I have milk which is not really certified, and I have another packet of milk which is certified. They're all in the same market. I'm likely to go for the product which is certified. So this means, because here I'm talking from the perspective of the consumer. So this means standards will be key in signaling the quality of the products, and this can give an edge for the farms which are involved in trade within the continent. And at the same time, the quality infrastructure will enable the various countries, or rather the AfCFTA states parties, to determine whether the goods which are being exported from their countries actually meet the set standards.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. I will come back to you probably with other more observation and question. Looking at what we really discussed shortly, with you on this passport as a rules of origin. And I would like now, probably we need to touch base on the trade policy. On this issue, our next presentation will be on rules of origin as key enabler to the success of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, looking at implementation of trade policy measures that include trade preferences, quota anti-dumping measures, and countervailing duties. Our speaker who will deliver this presentation is Mr. Mawana, who is the Program Manager Officer under UNCTAD. Mr. Mawana is a Program Manager Officer under UNCTAD, as I said, project in the COMESA Trade Facilitation Program. He's a holder of a master's degree in physical studies and has over 30 years experience working on as a customs expert in the Region and Continental Integration Initiative. He has hand-on experience in customs, technical instrument and trade procedures impacting on rules of origin. He held the position of Director, Customs Technical Services in the Customs and Excise Department of the Eswatini Revenue Services from 2011 to 2014. The Directorate administered the rules of origin. He also facilitated the AU members drafting and negotiating rules of origin for the African Continental Free Trade Area. Mr. Mawana, you can share your presentation. Thank you. Put on full view. Thank you. You can unmute, please. You are muted. You are muted. You are muted. Okay.
That's fine. Okay, I finally managed to unmute myself. Thank you very much, moderator. And I would like to say good afternoon who is in this session. And thank you very much, Marianka, for the early session that is actually facilitated in enabling a couple of things that I'll be talking about. My name is already introduced, and I work for UNCTAD, the ASCUDA program based in Lusaka, Zambia, where we have a project. It includes all these aspects, even the element of rules of origin and facilitating the exchange of certificates of origin is part of the project that we are working on at COMESA. So I will be looking at the issue of the rules of origin as a key enabler to the success of the AfCFTA. So in doing so, I would like to focus on just a brief overview of the AfCFTA, the concept of rules of origin from a policy perspective, the benefits and opportunities in a free trade area like the AfCFTA, and we conclude with some recommendations and conclusions that we can observe in this presentation. So to start with, we look at the rules of origin in the AfCFTA, and it has been said many, many times that the rules of origin confer an economic nationality to the goods so that they can access the market at preferential treatment in those countries that have agreed to be part of a free trade area. Like we have in Africa, more than 40 countries are now state parties. We need to underline that for a free trade area to be effective, the rules of origin must be in place, must be implemented properly. Then the benefits of a free trade area will be seen by those parties in that arrangement. So without effective rules of origin in place, there will be no additional benefit of trading in those goods. Otherwise, people can as well pay the full duties or find other concessions to use where they import goods into the countries. So first, the concept of rules of origin is to say it has to be seen as a tool for the countries who are in a free trade area to industrialize themselves and create value chains around themselves. They also have to be a tool that will say, if your level of trade is currently at 10% among your regional economic arrangements, how can you use this free trade area to build more trade, boost trade, which is the trade creation? It will also be a tool that says, if we have managed to put ourselves as a free trade area, we need to be able to detect those who are trying to take advantage of our arrangements when they are not meeting our requirements or they are not members of that free trade arrangement. So the issues of trade deflection, this is where some goods from outside the free trade area are sneaked in, disguised as originating in one of the member states, then they distort the market. So we need to have rules of origin that will be enforceable to say we can easily detect that there is something wrong here and we can deal with it. These rules of origin are also a tool to enforce some trade measures and some restrictions, issues of anti-dumping duties, issues of safeguards measures. You can use now to say, when the goods come from this particular country, we need to raise these trade measures so that we can control certain injuries that can be suffered by our local industries. Some of these measures, like anti-dumping duties and other safeguard measures, they are also applicable even where there is no preferential treatment, the non-preferential rules of origin. Some of them apply across, but it is more critical when you now have a free trade area, because you want to ensure that the free trade area benefits are enjoyed by those who are parties to this arrangement. So in short, we can say the concept of rules of origin is to ring fence the market for the producers in that free trade area. In our case, we are trying to ring fence the AfCFTA market for the producers who are doing the production in Africa. So we should see producers moving into an African country to take advantage of the free trade area among the more than 40 state parties now, or among as many countries that will be in the AfCFTA in the long term. So at the end of the day, the concept of rules of origin is to say, let's guarantee prosperity among our industries as members of this free trade area. Otherwise, we need to see other goods coming into our area being less competitive than ours among ourselves. The universal criterion that is used to determine the rules of origin, these are actually common in all the agreements. It's a matter of the language and how they are packaged that may differ, but otherwise, either you are dealing with the wholly obtained goods, like your vegetables and minerals, or you have substantially transformed these goods, where now you've got elements of change of tariff classification, or you're putting a threshold on the number of, or the value of non-originating materials, or you are saying, let's make sure that they are processed in a specific way so that they can only qualify if they fulfill that condition. So at the end of the day, what we should see is the drafters of rules of origin take into account the national policies that they are enforcing at home. They must draft the rules in such a way that they identify the most appropriate criterion that will support industrialization and trade across the FTA. So in this case, we have got members of the AfCFTA or state parties. The rules of origin that they negotiated should be addressing their needs, for instance, industrialization. If they believe that by limiting the value of non-originating materials from outside Africa, we will be improving industrialization in Africa, you'll find they will use that criterion on that product. If they believe, well, we don't have capacity in Africa, let's allow materials from outside Africa, we have massive transformation through the change of tariff classification, then that will be it. They will agree on that. So this criterion is standard, but its application should take into account the policy needs of the members of those countries. When it now gets into the legislation, their agreed agreement, it must be reflective of their policies as a collective. Then the benefits of the AfCFTA and opportunities for business. The AfCFTA presents member states or state parties in the case of the AfCFTA with opportunities for industrialization and creation of regional value chains and decent jobs. It is only when we have an active free trade area that will see opportunities for jobs being built as more industries take advantage of the market access. So, as the earlier speaker indicated, the intra-regional economic community trade, what is happening in COMESA, in ECOWAS, in all other RECs, should be a build-up to what will happen in Africa under the AfCFTA. So in this case, stakeholder involvement at negotiations level and the reviewing stages is very, very critical, so that the errors that we may have had at regional level, we make sure that at AfCFTA level, we don't repeat the same mistakes, but instead we achieve industrialization and increase in trade. The other element is that member states agencies should actually provide sectorial and demand-driven capacity building. This is a policy position that should be taken at national level to say, if we've got a market in West Africa today, and from Southern Africa, we could not access that market yet because there was no trade agreement with countries in West Africa, the AfCFTA is in place. But what product exactly will we take to West Africa from Southern Africa? That must be done, driven by the needs of the sectors in the economy and driven by the businesses that want to access that market. To that extent, we need to see that these benefits will only come into being when you put into place multidisciplinary committees that will now look at, say, how can we optimize on the AfCFTA opportunities? In other words, the AfCFTA, if you look at it today, it will have substantial benefits 5 to 10 years from now or from 2021, because the reduction of tariffs is progressive over the next 5 to 10 years. So we need now to strategize from national strategies to identify the opportunities in the AfCFTA all the way in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. How will our industries benefit from the AfCFTA as we go down? Then we need to embark on a product mapping using the rules of origin and tariff concessions. If a country today has reduced the tariffs to 0, how many of our companies can use that opportunity and go and sell the goods there? The utilization of free trade area rules of origin like the AfCFTA, it needs to be measured and we need to optimize on it. We need to be saying today, since 2021, how many countries have moved goods using the AfCFTA certificate of origin? That must be measured. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we need to be able to stimulate the use of free trade area and make sure that the cost of complying with the rules of origin should be enough to say it boosts competitiveness. We should not have the case of Woolworths where the person would rather just pay the duties and forget about the complexities of getting the certificates of origin. So in conclusion, which is a summary of what I've already said, the AfCFTA legal framework now enables the private sector to really embark on industrialization and development of value chains across Africa. That's a broad opportunity that is being availed by the AfCFTA. But for that to happen, preferential treatment in the AfCFTA will have to see us scaling up productivity and deepening Africa's economic integration and our share in the global markets. We need to say it is an opportunity to sell amongst ourselves, yes, but we need to increase productivity, and we must see this spilling over into other markets as well. There is a need for capacity building for producers of goods and services, especially MSMEs, as someone has already said, for them to produce to scale. If they are producing 10 units today, how can we incentivize them to produce more for the new market that is coming up? But that can also be done through coordination by government agencies, guaranteeing that business access to the markets and preferential treatment will be achievable, harmonizing the procedures and simplifying them to make sure that these people can find it easy to move their goods. And then we need to empower them, especially MSMEs, for optimal utilization of all the FTAs, starting with at regional level. If you cannot compete at commercial level, how do you expect to compete at continental level? Unless the continental level has got a better regime, yes, but otherwise, let's build up from the home setup and then we move further up. The AfCFTA state parties should also embrace e-tools to enhance trade facilitation at borders. The delays at borders can actually be a stumbling block that will derail the whole purpose of the AfCFTA. Therefore, we need to also look at how can we facilitate movement of goods. The AfCFTA legislation in many areas provides for electronic procedures. If those can be embraced, the COVID-19 has already taught lessons. We cannot argue on that. We need to embrace technology to move our goods. So on this stage, given the limited time, I'll stop here and maybe we'll unpack the rest as we get questions in the session. Thank you very much.
Ara, thank you. Thank you very much. You demonstrated that the rules of origin, when we look at the trade policies, they can be used as a tool to industrialize our continent. It can be also used as a tool for trade creation on our continent. It can also help to access the market, or actually even the capacity building, where you ended up saying our MSMEs should be on the focus for this AfCFTA. It does linking. We see now that the rules of origin are linked to trade and industrial policies. If they are too soft, a free trade zone runs the risk of not spurring the creation of local value, as creating the creation of trade, as you said. If they are complex, once again, countries risk being considered too protectionist, and farms may find the rules of origin too difficult to conform with. In this scenario, what will be your advice for the African situation to assure that rules of origin remain the greatest strategy and enabler for the implementation of the AfCFTA agreement? And what could be the role of standard in this whole process?
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are about three elements in this question. I picked the first one is about the rules of origin being simple or complex. How can this be dealt with? As I indicated earlier on, the basic fact that countries negotiated the rules, we assume that the experts who were involved were cognizant of the need to industrialize Africa. And they struck a balance between, are they too simply to allow trade deflection? They managed to block that, or they should have considered that. And then they should also look at the needs of the industries and say, we need to make sure that this is the most ideal that will enable a company to import the raw materials. If we don't have the materials in Africa, can we enable them to come from outside Africa to be processed in Africa, and then they go to the market. So that's the first thing. Complexity or simplicity may be relative, because one of the areas which I've always found when people say the rules are too complex, at times is because, especially these product-specific rules, they use the tariff classification issue. So if you don't have an understanding of the harmonized system, that is a technical area which needs a lot of understanding and a lot of study. So that may be a handicap in terms of knowledge. On the other hand, you find that we use the WTO valuation agreement, which is used at customs. If you don't understand these terms which are used in moving goods, and we say you must not exceed so much of the CIF value, the language alone may become a barrier, and people say these are now complex. But it may be a question now of saying, how best can we implement using the rules that we've agreed on? And what countries need to do is to deliberately move into industries, move away from the boardrooms in those 90 floors and all that, go down to the factory shops, to the factories, and say, if you are producing tomato paste, you can qualify because the tomatoes are wholly produced. Then someone will be saying, okay, let me contract farmers to give me the tomatoes. And then we start boosting the whole chain from the farms all the way up to exporting tomato paste to other countries. So it needs us to see the industries being capacitated through a deliberate move. Like in the case, I attended one workshop where a colleague from South Korea said they used mobile offices where the standards people, the customs people, the trade people will go to this SME and say, this is how you can qualify to export the goods. Then once you give that knowledge to the factory manager, not a board member sitting elsewhere, but the factory manager, then you can stimulate production and we should see the goods going through. And finally, you asked about how this scenario can be dealt with in terms of standards. As the earlier speaker indicated, standards are no longer something that we can run away from now. We have consumers who are aware of their rights. They know what affects their health, and they are in a position where they want to be seeing this assurance that the goods are indeed safe for them to consume. So in that case, they must be properly labeled and all those other requirements to ensure that the consumers will have the appetite. Then as they consume the goods, we boost the trade. IPR issues, or again, if we have innovators, we want them to be protected. Otherwise, our knowledge will be taken by other continents and we remain buying that knowledge back. So there is need to really have strong IPR laws. The advantage is that the AfCFTA agreement has got all these annexes dealing with standards, IPR, tariff barrier, non-tariff barriers, and all those things. So legislative and policy-wise, we are okay. Let's go down now to talk to the people who have to benefit, which is the businesses, and give them the capacity to move the goods in compliance with all those requirements.
Thank you very much, Mawana. Thank you for your insight on this topic. I will come back to you probably with the question, and you can continue also checking the chat if there are some questions you can probably react on. At this juncture, whatever we are talking about, the issue of industrialization coming in, facilitating trade, we know those who are doing trade are the private sector. I would like to now have a discussion with the private sector. We have with us John Bosco Kalisa, who is the executive director of East Africa Business Council. He's an economist by professional, specialized in econometrics, trade policy, investment promotion, and private sector development and taxation related issues. He has a master's degree in commerce with economics from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a bachelor degree in economics from the National University of Rwanda. He has in-depth understanding of the regional economic community and has participated fully in negotiations of international, continental, and regional agreement. He's currently, as I said, the East African Business Council CEO. John Bosco, you had the beautiful things. Yeah, the beautiful things that Mawana talked about, Laura talked about. We can industrialize, we can use these tools as rules of origin. I would like to hear from you. Yeah, what really are your expectations on the rules of origin within the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Yeah, good afternoon, colleagues, and greetings from EABC here in Arusha, United Republic of Tanzania. Let me first appreciate you, my brother, Homogene, in terms of organizing this interesting webinar. Interesting webinar discussing an important issue of rules of origin. And I can't agree more with what Mawana said. In terms of rules of origin, if you get it right, is an important tool for industrialization. It boosts trade creation as opposed to trade diversion. Those are very strong sentiment, and really those supports our agenda in terms of regional integration, in terms of how do we use rules of origin as a passport, as a tool for industrialization, for value addition, for job creation. I think that sends a very strong signal in terms of the business community to understand the rules of origin and the importance of rules of origin. So we've, again, from Aurora presentation, and it is like in taxation, there are canons of rules of origin, or there are principles that govern the rules of origin. One of the principles is the simplicity, predictability, flexibility in terms of rules of origin. And also because that is what the business community envisage or anticipate from the CFTA, from our customs union where I sit at the EAC, I would be wondering that why are we not growing intra-regional trade from the current level of 20% to 50%. Sometimes it's because of the trade instruments that are in place that have been crafted by very competent economists, very competent lawyers in the region, tend to become so restrictive, tend to become so complex, so rigid, and they don't really facilitate trade, rather they hinder trade. So that is the message. The message as we move towards continental free trade here, and I'm happy that the negotiations under rules of origin have reached a level that continental rules of origin are around now 87.7% agreed upon. And I think Aurora touched on it, what she called a regional-wide or regime-wide rules of origin. That provides a framework for us as REC to ensure that our rules of origin fits into the continental rules of origin. They are harmonized, they are integrated, they are able to facilitate and enable the growth of continental free trade area. So when you look at the EAC, and I wanted to share with you, when you look at the rules of origin that were first adopted by EAC in 2005, during the commencement of Customs Union Protocol, their main objective, and still remains the major objective, is to qualify a product that should enjoy the preferences. A product produced within our region should enjoy preferences than those products outside the region. So the preference accorded to the products produced in EAC should be different from other products that are not within the customs union. But what we've seen across the board is that there has been a level of transshipment, and Aurora mentioned about transshipment. Rules of origin are intended to detect or deter transshipment because they need to protect our regional value chain. They need to support the growth of our regional chain, our regional value chain. They need to enhance our competitiveness. And I want to also to give you an example. Recently, UNECA undertook a study in terms of preference utilization, looking at COMESA, looking at the EAC, SADC, And I'm happy to report that EAC, given the simplicity, given the nature of our rules of origin and administration, again, to thank the customs here, because we find that under EAC now, the rules of origin are being administered by customs to prevent an abuse of those rules of origin. So you find that the more they are flexible, the more the private sector understands these rules, the absorption capacity of the private sector and the uptake is very high. Generally, EAC scored higher than other rates in terms of the simplicity, utilization, and administration of rules of origin. So that is the message, and that's what is required. And from the discussion by my good friends from trade economists, that is the paradigm shift. That is a kind of a game changer. If we are to benefit from continental free trade area, we must ensure that the rules of origin are very simple, they are very flexible. Administration, there is transparency and accountability in those rules, because when there is no transparency, then they are subjected to abuse. That's why I said the transshipment happens, because, and that impacts or hinders the growth of intra-regional trade. So that is a key canon in terms of the usability, in terms of administration of the rules of origin. And you did mention that, yes, so that is a very critical. And I wanted just to highlight an element that were highlighted by Aurora, and want again to thank her in terms of the single transformation and double transformation. Single transformation, the rules of origin, especially with market access preferences under EU, under GOA, they were more simple, usable than our regional rules of origin. I think it is a lesson we need to take into consideration, especially what my friend Mawana mentioned. The criteria are very clear in terms of what are produced goods, but those that need transformation, the interpretation, the value addition, the threshold, that's where we go wrong in terms of understanding, infusing those and understanding those criteria and how they affect or enhance the growth of inter-regional trade or continental level. So my submission, moderator, is that the key from the private sector, let's try to simplify the rules of origin. Let us make them so transparent. Let us, the administration, be very flexible. Let's invest heavily in awareness creation, in sensitizing our micro, small, medium enterprises, because they constitute the bulk of our trade. So that is my message, and I want to really thank all the panelists and yourself, the moderator.
Thank you, John. Very interesting. You ended up touching on value addition. Value addition, levels of our transformation ability and capacity. If you look at our African private sector, given their industrial, technological capacity, to fully benefit on these rules of origin, the issue of quality, on validation comes in. What do you think will be the role of compliance to standards if we will be again competing, as mentioned by other presenters, with the AGOA provision, with the European provision, with the most favored nation principles? What do you see as compliance to the standard? Because as Mawana said, our consumers are now demanding more on the quality issues. What do you see as the role of compliance to standards? You can unmute.
Trying to unmute. Okay, thank you very much. You are raising an important issue. Again, it resonates well with the topic of rules of origin. Our ability in terms of to produce quality products that meets both the regional consumer demands, it is a paramount, it is a precondition in terms of us gaining the market, regional and continental market access. So standard harmonization, generally, was where I sit. I'm very frustrated that our pace in terms of standard harmonization is very slow. At current, we're talking about 13%. How are we going to benefit from CFTA when we have only harmonized 13% of our standards? We cannot trade because we need to build confidence among our consumers that the product we are putting in the market meets both regional and international standards. Now, recently, there are other standards that have been introduced: environmental standards, safety standards, child labor-related standards. So we need to comply. Compliance is a key word. We need to comply. We need to invest heavily. And my brother, who is holding that position, you have a very daunting task. You have a daunting task to upscale your game in terms of pushing for standard harmonization. And investment in quality infrastructure is a key, because we need to build a consumer confidence. And you can only do that where I sit at the ABC, we are saying we are promoting Buy East Africa, Build East Africa, but our consumers are saying some of our products don't meet the standards. You go to the supermarket, you find the packaging, the labeling, the marks are not well pressed. So it is really a daunting task that we need to work together with our development partners. I'm happy some of the partners are here. We need to invest heavily in standard harmonization, in quality-related infrastructure. We need to raise awareness in terms of standards if we are to benefit optimally from continental free trade area or other preferential arrangement we have. Standards is a precondition. Both standards and rules of origin, as I said, once you don't get them right, they become technical barrier to trade. They become an NTB. And that's what we've seen. That is the evidence I've seen from the private sector that impacts our competitiveness, that impacts our value addition, that impacts our industrialization. We need to meet the standards. We need to meet the rules of origin. So it is really a daunting task in terms of awareness raising, creation, education, and training for our players.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will up the game on harmonization of standard. As you said, working together with the private sector, I think it's very key. Looking at the discussion, what you said, John Bosco, what the previous speaker were talking about, the level of industrialization is very key. And we have examples of European Union, that we have our speaker from the European Union side, who is Mrs. Ursula Stepkowiska, the deputy head of unit in DG Trade, dealing with Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. She has 14 years experience in the European Commission. For 4 years, she held the position of head of section for rules of origin in DG Trade, during which she was responsible for coordinating of trade policy on rules of origin, the negotiations of rules of origin in EU, free trade agreement with Mercosur, Mexico, Australia, Chile, and the UK, as well as implementation of EU FTA with Japan, Canada, Indian community, and the Central American countries. She participated in the discussions of the WTO Committee on Rules of Origin on implementation of the 2015 Nairobi Ministerial Decision in Preferential Rules of Origin. She will be now discussing with us on recognition and enactment of requisite industrial infrastructure and the policy framework looking at rules of origin in the EU single market. Ursula, you can share your presentation.
Good afternoon, and it's great pleasure to be here today with you. I am really delighted, and I listened to it a lot of attention to the previous speakers. I just wanted to confirm that you see the presentation and you hear me well.
Yes, we see the presentation and we can hear you well. Thank you.
Thank you. So my presentation will be very practical and concrete, and I wanted to present you the approach the EU has to preferential rules of origin. So the basic is that you can import export products at reduced or zero duties, provided that the goods you are exporting are originating. So when they are complying with rules of origin of this particular FTA or unilateral preferences. And in the EU, we have two sets of preferential rules of origin. The GSP rules of origin that has been also mentioned today during the meeting. And these are unilateral measures. They can be found in the Union Customs Code and implementing provisions, but they are also responding to the harmonization of rules of origin asked in the WTO in the context of the Nairobi decision on preferential rules of origin for least developed countries. And here I wanted to emphasize that this new set of rules is considered in the WTO by the review done by different countries as one of the most development friendly. And these rules have been developed after the study that the previous speaker referred to. So this is a new generation of rules, and they are the benchmark actually considered in the WTO context. Now, we have also rules of origin applied in EU FTAs. We have around 36, 37 of FTAs with around 80 partners. So you can imagine that this is a big spaghetti ball, and they are found in the protocols to all EU FTAs. They are not subject of harmonization at multilateral level. So they are set by the parties who negotiate an FTAs. However, currently there are also some efforts in the World Customs Organization to harmonize these rules. What is the most important from my presentation is the reform of rules of origin that the EU conducted in 2011. And these rules have been simplified significantly. They have been also relaxed, and they introduced much more simplified custom procedures and certification. They are also considered as a model for other FTAs, and we have been introducing those in different EU FTAs, including recently modernization process with ISA, IPA. What are then the key features? And I want to also focus a bit on industrialization and the practical aspect here. First of all, the rules of origin, the level of relaxation depends on the partner's development level. So in the EU GSP, in everything about arms, the level of allowed non-originating materials is up to 70%. And we also offer single transformation for textiles, the same as in AGOA. Other GSP beneficiaries, they are allowed up to 50% of non-originating materials. So there is already differentiation and taking into account development level. Second, what we have done is also we looked into our production patterns, import and export patterns. So we have taken into account domestic production and global value chains. How did we do it? So I will walk you through different examples. So for in the product-specific rules for agriculture products and main agriculture inputs, they are considered they need to be wholly obtained in the country. So they cannot be imported. They need to be produced in the country, and this supports local production in the EU, but also local production in the partner countries like under EPAs. For processed agriculture products, we have allowed some percentage of non-originating materials that we are importing. And for example, in all EU FTAs, we argue that we need a specific, like with Japan, we argue that we need a specific percentage of the non-originating sugar because we do import sugar from the ACP countries. So, and we have had this discussion explaining this with Japan, Mercosur, Mexico, and any other country. So some other materials are also allowed, but sugar is here the most important example. Then what we have also done, we have significantly simplified the rules. And there is only, for most of the products, we have one rule per HS chapter. And we have, in the past, there were several different rules in one chapter for, let's say, chemicals. You had 10 different rules. Now there is only one set of rules. And within this set of rules, we give business choice. And this is important. So for most of the sectors, we have two rules. One is based on change of tariff classification and another on value added. And why? Because business produce goods differently. And sometimes it's easier for them to check tariff classification. In some cases, it's easier for them to calculate value added. So this gives flexibility for business to comply. Now, in terms of what is the percentage of non-originating materials that we allow for industrial products. So in the old rules, before the reform, and this is also in some older EPAs as well, the allowed percentage was around 20, 30, 40% of non-originating materials. Now, horizontally, for most of industrial products, we introduced maximum 50% of non-originating materials. Why? Because industry globally is more integrated. And for example, EU is the biggest exporter of machinery, but it's also the biggest importer of machinery parts. So this is why we also recognize that the industry is and the value chains are globalized. However, we are also preventing transshipment. So this is why we do not allow simple assembly of non-originating parts. So if somebody wants to import all the parts from China and assemble them and sell it to from the EU to Mexico, it will not be allowed because this product will not be considered European. Now, a few examples. Specific sectors, chemicals. Here, this is a sector that is the most globally integrated. And this is where we have the most liberal set of rules that allows these inputs to be traded globally without many barriers. So we have rules based on chemical processes. So it's enough that you conduct, for example, a chemical reaction at your territory, but we don't ask to check where the inputs are coming from. So this facilitates already compliance. Then there is also change of tariff classification and value added. But in principle, what you can see globally is that these three alternative rules you can find in most of the FTAs in the world. So it's a kind of natural harmonization. Now, the second sector that I wanted to mention is textile and clothing. And to mention single transformation in the EBA, everything but arms, but also in EPAs, in the economic partnership agreements. And what we have observed is that thanks to the fact that you can import textiles in order to fabrics to produce clothing, it was possible to develop production capacities in Madagascar, Mauritius, and Lesotho. So this has already contributed to diversification of trade and industrialization. Another example is car sector. So in EU FTAs, we have only one rule there, and this is value added rule. Why it's so specific? Because we do not allow assembly of non-originating parts, and you need to, you can use up to 50% of non-originating materials. What this rule contributed in the EU SADC EPA was that thanks to the rule and the accumulation with the EU, this sector has been thriving in the last year. In 2020, for example, EU exported 1.6 billion euros of car parts, but South Africa developed its industrial base and assembly of cars of different companies, but the ones exported to the EU accounted for 3.5 billion euros. So you can see that what the EU imports from South Africa is much more what we are exporting in terms of parts. So very good example of industrialization. Then on machinery, in principle, we allow up to 50% of non-originating materials. And this is a very important sector. So you will also need to see where you take the parts, and here also geographical proximity make also a difference. Again, transshipment is an issue, so just simple assembly of non-originating parts will not confer origin. I wanted also to briefly mention the issue of accumulation. You can have flexible rules, and then you can use up to 50% of non-originating materials from any country. But you can also, on top of it, use accumulation with and treat the input of the partner country as its own. And this has particular importance in the regional context. And I think that this is also the principle of the African Continental AfCFTA, to be able to accumulate all the inputs. We have a great experience with the system of pan-Euro-Mediterranean accumulation, where some of the North African countries are also involved. We have also accumulation between ASEAN countries in our FTA with Singapore, and EPAs, so economic partnership agreements. They also allow accumulation between different EPAs in Africa and also with the GSP countries, so that we encourage also regional integration. How this is used in practice, this is another issue. And here there are also cooperation between customs is required. However, as such, this facilitation exists and aim to support regional integration. Then, as the last point, I wanted to also discuss lowering compliance cost for economic operators for business. And this is what we have heard just before. What is important for business, for European business, is to ensure coherence between different trade agreements as much as possible. And I've heard it also from many speakers today. It is important to have a very similar set of rules of origin. And when we have been looking also into the African Continental FTA, we do see that there are many similarities with what we have, for example, in EPAs or the new generation of EU FTAs. So this will definitely help also to for business to comply with both systems. Then the second point that I wanted to make is with regard to transparency of those rules, because references are not theoretical. The governments can agree an agreement, but in order for the preferences to be utilized, business need to know them. We had in the EU a big problem with access to information for business. And what we have developed 2 years ago was a Rules of Origin Self-Assessment Tool, ROSA, which basically is business friendly because you introduce your tariff code and it walks you through step by step what you need to do to comply with the Rules of Origin. It explains you the rules, it gives you examples so that you are not lost, and shows you also what kind of procedures and what kind of certificates you need to use in order to comply. And afterwards, at the end, you will get a self-assessment and statement whether on the basis of your input and processes, you comply with rules or not. This has been a stunning success in the EU database. We have a lot of positive feedback from business, and I would really truly advertise this tool also for your context. Then the next aspect is simplifying the customs procedures. I was referring to product-specific rules, but customs procedures is another aspect of rules of origin. And what we have done in the EU, in EU FTAs, we have moved from governmental certificates to self-certification by exporters only. This is to make sure that we facilitate trade and that we take out the burden from the business to go to the customs and get the stamp that they comply with rules of origin. So they can self-certify their export. And this is the, in the context of the GSP, it's called registered exporter system. We have moved from the older system of approved exporters. So again, self-certification has been the key feature of our new FTAs. And few thoughts for the future. I think what is important in terms of multi-country negotiations on the rules of origin is to reconcile different traditions regarding management of rules of origin, but also economic interests, because one country might have a different interest than the other. And this needs to be taken into account while designing the rules. Of course, we also know that on some sectors are more difficult than the others, so negotiations may prolong, and there is always a risk of failure. But here, I think that in the context of the African Continental FTAs, most of the rules have been agreed already. So this is the question remains of some key sectors still to be developed. What is key for EU business is to have to work towards a common platform of rules of origin on the basis of similar rules. And I've heard also that different tracks might have different approaches. There are different also probably rules in the EU FTAs or might be similar. So it's important to have a system that is as much as harmonized as possible. And then the same with regard to proof of origin. If you use already one system of proof of origin, then it will be much easier to apply it also to other trade arrangements rather than creating new systems. And then the promotion of regional integration, formulation it's an important political concept, but also can be used by business in practical terms, and this facilitates compliance with rules of origin. And the last point is that even if you have a set of rules of origin, it is key to have access to information and communicate this to economic operators. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Arzura. One key component now, clarify even further what we have been discussing is that the issue you have reviewed the existing rules of origin, and you gave good examples on actually what we are doing together on the continent or in general for developing countries in the chemical area, textile and clothing, car sector and machinery. The level of industrialization that you have on the European side, I would like to ask you one question. What was the role of standards or quality infrastructure in the whole process? Because if we are talking about buying the parts from SADC region, Southern Africa region, there is interconnectivity of those parts should fit into your system, into your industry. Yeah, what was the role of the standards in all this? Yes, you have rules of origin, but is it just enough? Was it happening just like that? Or was there any capacity building or any other action done by the European side on the issue of quality infrastructure?
Thanks a lot for this question. So I think we need to differentiate between the treatment of goods at the border and the treatment of goods at the market. Rules of origin they are a very simple tool. You will get reduced or zero tariffs if you comply with rules of origin. And this is your first step to enter the border of a country. But it doesn't mean that you don't need at the same time to fulfill the standard of that particular market. And this is also in order to understand the market realities and how you can also export, import your products, you need to understand the requirements of the export country. So what are the standards in that country, marketing standards, or generally standards. So these are two different aspects. However, I think we can draw also some common points in the sense that in terms of standards, if you build on international standards, then it's easier also, which is the basis also in the TBT agreement, then it's easier also to comply, and you can add additional features, but this is your baseline. And the same in case of rules of origin. If you use the set of rules that is very similar across your FTAs, the easier it will be for you also to comply. Then the second aspect is related also to cooperation between the different authorities. In case of standards, basically what is important is that at a government level or the standardization bodies level, there is a dialogue, so that there is also good understanding of what are the standards required, so that also it's communicated well and business can comply. The same in rules of origin. So the customs authorities of both exporting and importing countries, they need to understand how to apply rules, because this is basically a mutual agreement between the two parties. And here what is important is to continue dialogue, work on implementation guidelines, and solve the issues as soon as they appear, rather than waiting for deteriorating the situation. And then the last aspect that I wanted to mention in this context is the question of the document, proof of origin or proof for standardization. I understand that, for example, in the EU, we very much use self-certification, while now in case of rules of origin, we have also introduced in most of EU FTAs self-certification by the exporter, so that it facilitates the use, so that the business does not need to go each and every time to customs, but takes responsibility for the compliance. So I have drawn some similarities between the two, which are different. However, there are common points that we need to keep in mind.
Thank you very much. Touching on, we shouldn't really reinvent the wheel. Look at the existing rules of origin, look at the existing standards. And the issue that's having responsibility in the hands also of traders, self-certification, that is key, information sharing. Yeah, like the case of Rosa and the register for the exporters. I think those are important examples that you have given us. Thank you very much. I might come back to you when other questions arise. Thank you, Arzula. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Looking at what Arzula said, what is on the European side? Yeah, let's not change the wheel. Yeah, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use what is existing. I would like to see at the world level, World Trade Organization, we have a speaker, Darla Marti, who is the trade policy specialist in the WTO, currently in charge of servicing the Committee on Rules of Origin and undertaking research and policy analysis on all topics related to rules of origin. Is also responsible for the preparation of UNCTAD flagship publication, Trade and Environment Review, which described the green economy and implications for developing countries. He is a specialist in international public law, international trade, and WTO law, trade negotiations, rules of origin, trade facilitation from University of Cambridge. Doran is going to discuss with us on facilitating international trade through transparent, consistent, uniform, impartial, and harmonized rules of origin based on a positive standard, the experience of the WTO. Darren, yeah, you can share your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see so many of you joining us for this session. I am, in addition to the introduction that was kindly made, I think the important point to highlight is that I've been serving as the secretary to the WTO Committee on Rules of Origin since 2013-14. And therefore, what I'll be sharing with you is some of the work that the WTO has been doing over the past couple of years regarding rules of origin. So I'll just share a brief presentation now that we can use to guide our discussions. I'm just trying to move to presentation mode. Okay, so I think the starting point is to note that in reality, we've had reports at the World Trade Organization and before that in the GATT about problems related to the management and administration of rules of origin. And in reality, these problems were already reported as far as 1950s. In fact, we've had in 1952 a recommendation to harmonize rules of origin already at that time so that there would be more clarity about the applicable rules. As I think you understood now, having heard the different speakers that preceded me, I think one of the problems with rules of origin for companies is that if you are a company based in Kenya exporting t-shirts to the United States, to Europe, to Japan, and to other African countries, you might need to handle 2, 3, 4, 7 sets of different rules of origin. And this is one of the reasons why companies find it difficult and costly to handle this, because it means that they need to have staff dedicated to understanding these requirements, and they also need to have their supply chains organized in a manner that they qualify for preferential treatment under the various FTAs or preferences under which they want to export. Another problem I think that quite often arises as well is that in reality we have 2 types of rules of origin. One is preferential, and today we have been talking mostly about preferential rules of origin. In fact, preferential rules of origin are those that allow companies to seek preferential treatment and duty-free treatment when they export under free trade agreements or preferences such as the EU EPAs or EBA or the American AGOA. But we also have a second type of rules of origin, and that's the rule of origin we call non-preferential. And non-preferential rules of origin are unilateral. They are enacted, decided by national legislation. We don't have international rules for that. And these are the rules that apply when companies are asked, for instance, to mark the origin of their goods in labels. This is the made in label that you see in products. You also have non-preferential rules of origin when you implement SPS, for instance, restrictions in case of sanitary or phytosanitary risk. And you also have non-preferential rule origin underpinning the utilization of instruments such as safeguard measures, anti-dumping duties, and countervailing measures. So you see, That means that if a company is exporting to a market that utilizes non-preferential origin, you might actually have different requirements applying under preferential agreements and non-preferential rules of origin. So it really leads to what we sometimes call the spaghetti bowl of origin requirements, which makes the picture quite complex for companies to navigate. And this is, in fact, I think, the problem that relates to transparency and predictability that we've already touched upon in previous presentations. The fact that irrespective of the actual rules, they need to be known and understood. It must be easy to retrieve them, and it must be easy for companies to interpret what they're reading. And this in turn relates to the problem of designing rules that are simple, that use plain language, and that use, as we say, positive standards. That means that the rules will say exactly what processes would confer origin, so that businesses can then plan their activities in relation to these requirements. But you see, all of these, I think, problems date already since the 50s or 60s or 70s. And that's the reason why we eventually came to a WTO agreement on rules of origin, which I'll speak about in a second. But I'd also like us to also think about a second dimension of rules of origin, which we've indirectly touched upon. I think now Ursula spoke a little bit more about this dimension, and this relates to the administration of the rules of origin. So one thing is the rule itself, and that, of course, as I said, has to be simple, has to be designed in plain language, cannot be too stringent. But then you have everything related to how we demonstrate compliance with the rules. And that's basically certificates of origin, verification, and also in the case of preferential rules of origin, we have rules related to transportation, direct consignment. And those aspects also need to be simple, because the rule can be very simple, but if companies find it difficult to require a certificate of origin, to request a certificate of origin, to obtain it and to present it, or if they are too afraid that in a verification case they'll need to provide too many documents to the verifying authority, that can also dissuade them from utilizing preferential rules of origin. So I'd also like to keep that second element in the back of our minds as we speak about the need for simplicity. Now, with these problems in mind, WTO members have actually agreed to a number of instruments in the WTO which relate to rules of origin. The first one, of course, is the Agreement on Rules of Origin. And the basic idea behind the agreement really is to try to harmonize non-preferential rules of origin. The idea is that members would negotiate origin criteria, they would design rules of origin, and once these rules would be agreed upon or endorsed at the multilateral level, all countries that are members of the WTO would have to utilize this common set of rules. But this only applies to the non-preferential rules of origin. So going back to what I said, the rules that applies to labeling, to anti-dumping, or to quotas, and so on. This does not affect the ability of countries to negotiate their preferential rules of origin under FTAs. But in addition to the agreement, we also have other instruments in the WTO that also cover aspects related to rules of origin. The first one is the GATT itself. There we have rules regarding fees. So for instance, the fact that the fees that countries ask for the issuance of certificates of origin should be as little as possible and commensurate with those services. We also have language regarding certification, and for instance, the need for countries to only require a certificate of origin when this is absolutely necessary. And in all other cases, we might actually not need a certificate of origin. And we also have some language concerning the marking of origin and the fact that made in labels should again be as simple as possible, bearing in mind the costs that they entail for businesses. Then we have the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is the newest multilateral agreement that we have in the WTO since 2015. And there we have a variety of provisions that require governments to implement rules of origin in the simplest manner. And this relates to single window, electronic signatures, electronic certificates, economic operators, and we have a variety of issues that deal with customs operation. I'll not go into the details, but we also have there, I think, what we can keep in mind from this agreement is whatever it is that your requirement is, try to do it in the most business-friendly manner, reducing red tape to a minimum, doing it as fast as possible, and in the least costly manner as possible. And then we have two ministerial decisions, one from 2013, the Bali ministerial decision, and one 2015, the Nairobi ministerial decision on preferential rules of origin for LDCs. And I think a couple of other speakers mentioned this decision in the past. And there, what we do is we have a specific strand of work in the committee where we look at trade from least developed countries, and we try to monitor the extent to which these countries are able to utilize trade preferences and the extent to which the underlying rules of origin there are simple and transparent. Now, as you can see, there's quite a lot I could speak about these instruments, but I will focus on only a couple of elements in the interest of time. But I would like to say two, I think, overarching comments before I move ahead. The first one is all of this has a dedicated forum in the WTO, and it's called the Committee on Rules of Origin. And the Committee on Rules of Origin is a forum where governments come together to exchange views, to share practices, to share best practices, or to identify best practices on all issues related to rules of origin. And this is a committee that is open to all WTO members. And in fact, I would welcome more participation from African delegations and from least developed country delegations on these issues. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this committee is that it generates knowledge that can be used by the regional economic communities in Africa and can be used by the negotiators of the African Continental Free Trade Area when they're trying to design the rules of origin that is going to govern trade among each other in that context. And the second comment, which derives from this first one, is the WTO doesn't exist. The WTO Secretariat is a secretariat that produces research at the request of members, that assists members, but ultimately the rules have to be negotiated and agreed upon by the members themselves. The Secretariat cannot edit rules by which members would be guided. So with these comments in mind, let me just say a few words about the agreement. As I just said, the purpose of the agreement is to launch negotiations for the harmonization of non-preferential rules of origin. And the idea there is if all members utilize a single standard, a single type of rule for all their non-preferential purposes, we would achieve predictability and transparency, because then firms would know what the standard is. And in fact, what the agreement does is to lay out a number of disciplines about how to achieve transparency, how to achieve predictability, the need for the rules to remain technical and neutral and not be manipulated, the need for the rules to be transparent and therefore notified to the WTO. But in reality, the negotiations have not achieved their end. Members were not able to adopt a single set of non-preferential rules of origin. And in reality, these negotiations have not been discussed at all in the past 10 years or so. And the reason is that there's really quite sharp differences in the way different members approach or envisage non-preferential rules of origin. And there's a number of members who believe at this point that harmonizing them would not be useful because it would diminish their ability to implement legislation in other areas like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards, and so on. But the agreement remains there as, I think, a benchmark of transparency and neutrality. And what members have instead been focusing on is really this need for transparency. So they have been studying each other rules of origin and engaging in what we call an educational exercise to try to better understand what members' practices in this area are and how they affect businesses. So that's for the agreement and for non-preferential rules of origin. But now let me move to preferential and the work of the Committee on Preferential Rules of Origin. And what I'd like to mention here is this issue that I touched upon in the beginning, that I think a lot of the discussions today focused on one in this graph, the origin criteria. So whether it's value added, whether it's change of tariff classification, whether you give companies an alternative between two rules, and whether the rule is drafted in a simple or in a complex manner. And of course, this is important. Of course, this is very important. I think I agree with all of the other speakers who said you need to get rules of origin right so that you, at the same time, promote regional value chains and achieve high levels of utilization of the agreement. If the rule is too stringent, and if companies cannot source locally or regionally the inputs that they need, they will simply not be able to utilize the agreement. I can give you an example. If you're producing curry powder, and if you say that curry powder needs to be wholly obtained in the region because you want to promote the producers of pepper, of garlic, of onion in the region, that's all very good. But if you don't produce cloves or cinnamon or turmeric in the region and they have to import these inputs, it means that from the beginning, this rule will not be utilized by companies simply because they cannot find the right ingredients or the right input from the region. And similarly, if they can find, let's imagine that they can't find cinnamon or they can't find, the packaging that they need, but the cost is too expensive, or they cannot ship it effectively from one country to the other, or coming back to regulations, technical regulations, if they don't meet the quality that the company needs, then they will choose not to work with regional suppliers and to work with suppliers outside the region. And there again, you will have a situation in which the agreement cannot be utilized. The rule proved to be too stringent in this case. And I think the problem here is finding that right balance between the stringency of the rules so that you have regional value chains with rules that promote competitiveness in the region and are not too stringent, as I explained. And the problem is that finding that balance is an industry-specific assessment, is a country-specific assessment, and is also an assessment that is dynamic over time. You might have better quality products as time evolves, and therefore this is not a fixed benchmark, but this is something that needs to be assessed over time as well. So as you see, quite complex, but I think what we can retain from this complexity is the need for review. I think we really need, in an African preferential rules of origin context, we need to set up the instruments calling for a permanent review of the rules and a monitoring of the utilization of the agreement that we can, so that we can identify lessons and bottlenecks for the future and to review the rules in the future. But as you can see here in the graph, we also have these two other dimensions, which I think are particularly important.
Aaron, if you can move faster to the conclusion, please. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. That are particularly important in an African context. The first one is certification. This also has to be as trade facilitating and as cheap as possible for companies. And this is not only about the importing country, but also about the institutions in the exporting country, because they are the ones who deliver certificates. And then the third dimension is transportation. And as we know, because of a lack of physical infrastructure, this is a real challenge in Africa. So we also have to have flexible rules concerning the transportation of this of goods. Now, one of the efforts we made at the WTO to help make rules more transparent was to create, with the International Trade Center and the World Customs Organization, a database that has a free platform that you can check. It's called the Origin Facilitator, and you can find FTA and preferential rules of origin for over 300 agreements. This is free to use, and you can find the rules of origin and other certification requirements at the tariff line level. So I leave this with you so that you can check. And the other area where I think that we have been doing work that can be useful for the region is in better understanding how rules of origin impact utilization. I've referenced here in the slide a number of WTO notes that you can also easily download from the WTO website. But basically, the purpose of this work, if we take a look at one of these lines here, if we take the Republic of Korea, we analyzed trade between LDCs and preference granting members. And we say, okay, the blue line is the share of lines that are not eligible for preferences. So we know that preferences don't apply. The red portion of the line is MFN 0. So there's no tariffs on this goods. So we know that, again, preferences don't apply. So there can't be any impact from preferential rules of origin. The green portion is the portion of trade that utilizes trade preferences. So we know that for that portion of trade, rules of origin are being utilized and they don't pose a problem. But then we have the purple portion, and this is trade that would be eligible for preferences and which cannot utilize preferences and therefore end up paying tariffs. That's what we are trying to understand. Why is that portion of trade paying tariffs despite being eligible for preferences? And this is the part of the work of the committee that I think generates knowledge and lessons that can be used in the context of the of African regional integration purposes. And again, I invite you to take a look at these notes for further information. So there you go. Apologies for the length. As I said, I would have had a lot of other thoughts as well on mind to share, but I think you have all the references in the presentation, and happy to take questions, of course, to move forward.
Darren, thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, moving toward the recommendation, I want to ask you, but in a way of, the WTO aims for harmonized rules of that are objective, understandable, predictable, and consistent, uniform, impartial. Yeah. What is the recommendation from the WTO? What should we do? What should we do to address the situation in these different FTAs that we discussed about, the spaghetti ball that we discussed about? Yeah, what would be one recommendation on the work that you are doing? You can say we should continue doing this.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think there are two issues. One is we actually have not recommendations, but obligations, legal obligations when it comes to the agreements. So I think that's the general framework that we have to look at. But now answering specifically your question on recommendations, and from the work that we have been doing, I think particularly related to least developed countries, what I'd like to say is this: getting rules of origin right is complicated. As I explained, I think it means weighting different policy objectives, encouraging regional trade, but at the same time encouraging the creation of regional value chains. And that can be an industry-specific assessment and a country-specific assessment. So because this is so complex, my recommendation number one is, from the beginning, you need to design institutional instruments for the monitoring of the utilization of the agreement. And where you find that the agreement is being underutilized or not utilized, you have to have mechanisms to review the reasons and to review rules of origin. And this means not necessarily the criterion only, but this could relate to certification, could relate to transportation, as I said. So there's a variety of issues there. But if you don't have the monitoring in place, you cannot capture that. So you need monitoring, and you need and you need to have the instruments, the mechanisms for review. This is recommendation number one. And I think recommendation number two is everything related to knowledge and transparency. Once you have the African Continental Free Trade Area running, you need to have programs in place to train businesses on the agreement, to raise awareness about the agreement, and to explain how rules of origin will be administered under the agreement. And this is irrespective of what rules you go for. And the third, and I think final recommendation I'd have is, don't underestimate, or don't forget, don't ignore this trade facilitation measure within the country. Certificates of origin are issued by the exporting country. So you need to have that process as simple as possible. It has to be cheap, has to be quick, and it has to be business friendly, so that businesses can obtain the certificates in order to export. And this has nothing to do with the African Continental Free Trade Area or regional economic communities. This has to do with countries undertaking trade facilitation reforms, talking to their businesses to set up simple processes in that context.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Darlan, for your presentation and recommendation. I would like to, in 1 minute, Nariaka, what is the takeaway message as a recommendation for this webinar?
Thank you, SG, and thank you to the other panelists. It has indeed been a really insightful session. Personally, I've learned quite a lot, but my key takeaway from this, or recommendation going forward, is we really need to be cognizant of how we design the rules of origin under the AfCFTA, because they will go a long way in determining, first of all, as Darlan has mentioned, the utilization, and also it will also go a long way in ensuring determining whether we achieve the objectives that have been set under the AfCFTA, such as industrialization, among others.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mawana, what would be your takeaway message?
Thank you very much, SG. I think in this case, having had the colleagues speaking, thank you very much to my co-speakers. We can look at the implementation side of it now that the AfCFTA launched trade as far back as January last year. What we need going forward now is to look at, say, how can we implement the agreement and implement it successfully using the rules of origin as a tool that will generate all that activity. So one thing we can recommend here is there is need to embrace technology. Where we are sitting today in Lusaka, Zambia, UNCTAD has developed an interconnectivity platform system where countries can exchange electronic certificates of origin going through the secretariat, and the secretariat will also be able to take logs to tell how many certificates were issued, how many were accepted, how many were rejected, and that will form the basis, as our colleague from WTO said, would now say, why are we having so few transactions covered by the certificates, or why are we having so many rejections? And then that will facilitate the review. Further on, there may be need also to say, for us to have all the players involved, we need to also embrace technology by way of single window systems. We can no longer afford, especially going the whole Africa-wide, to say documents will move physically from one place to the other and so forth. But with single windows in a particular country, the processes at that level will be simpler and it will facilitate a lot of movement without much hindrances. And those are all the works that UNCTAD is already working on, and it can be applied across the regs and all the way to the AfCFTA level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moana. In 1 minute, Carissa, as a private sector, yeah, what is your takeaway message? 1 minute. John Bosco. I move to Maria. Yeah. Or Zura, what would be your takeaway message in 1 minute? Mrs. Ozura, are you still with us?
Hello, moderator.
Yes, John Bosco. Yes. In 1 minute,
Yeah, sorry,
what is your takeaway message?
No, the takeaway message again from this webinar is that we need to work together. We need to work together to drive the integration agenda, again, by simplifying the rules of origin, by raising awareness to our SMEs and corporates to take advantage of the CFTA. And we need to continue share this vital information on rules of origin and standardization, because they are key instruments for industrialization, for value addition, for job creation, for building resilience. So the tripartite partnership is critical. Government, private sector, and development partner need to work together to drive those instruments that enables our trade, enables our industrialization, enables the growth of intra-regional trade. That is the message I pick. And again, we have the knowledge, we have the skills, we need to bring it down to the lowest segment of our society. Thank you, Asantini.
Thank you very much. While you are putting on your video, because I want to take a group photo, I would like to summarize the key recommendation that I grouped in. We have really 4 recommendations. We need to design institution instrument for monitoring, for the implementation of the provision of the agreement, especially on rules of origin, but also linking to the technology, interconnectivity, and the system for single window system. That is the one recommendation that came out. Secondly, we need to have programs, to train the business community, on these rules of origin and share the information. And third, we should not ignore the trade facilitation that exists within different countries. The last recommendation is to understand how we will be designing, how we continue to design the rules of origin under the AfCFTA to enable industrialization on our continent. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Laura Nariaka, who spoke on different issues on rules of origin, and thank you also for responding to different questions under the chat. I would like to thank Moana. I would like to thank John Bosco Carissa, Maria Stepkowiska. I would like to thank Darren, Marty, our speakers, and who have been with us sharing their knowledge for free. Thank you very much. I think if we were in a physical meeting, you would deserve a glass of wine. Yeah, but we postponed that glass of wine at the next time. Uh, Thank you, participant. If you were not there, we cannot do anything. Yeah, we thank you for always joining us on different webinars, monthly webinars of ARZO. Our next webinar will be on 15th June 2022 on common regulatory framework and trade. Please also join us, and those available, you can also join our ARZO General Assembly later on in the month of June, from 29 June to 1st of July. I now want to ask you to put on your camera for a group photo. We shouldn't forget, even these virtual meetings are important to remember what we have done during this difficult period of COVID. Thank you very much. Yeah, please put on your photo and beautiful faces and smiles. Yeah. Thank you. I see my brothers from Turkey, from USA, from Asia. Yeah, thank you for joining our webinar. Yeah, see you next time. Thank you very much. Have a great day or a great evening. Thank you. Bye.